Buckingham Palace, May 1910. A king is dying. Edward VII, the man they called the Caresser, the most publicly affectionate and privately faithless monarch Britain had seen in generations, is lying in his bedroom, breathing with difficulty, surrounded by those who love him, and those who were paid to. His wife is there. Queen Alexandra is still beautiful at 65, still composed, still the woman the entire nation has adored for nearly 50 years. She has been summoned home from a visit abroad because the doctors finally admitted the truth. He is not going to recover this time. And then a carriage arrives at the palace gates. A woman steps out, elegantly dressed, perfectly controlled, utterly familiar to every courtier and servant in the building. Alice Keppel. The king's mistress, his companion of 12 years, the woman who has accompanied him on holidays, who has sat beside him at dinners, who has been, in every meaningful social sense, his other wife. She enters the sick room. She curtsies to the Queen. The dying king, barely conscious, beckons her to sit beside him. And then, in one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the British monarchy, he insists that his wife kiss his mistress. That Alexandra leans forward and presses her cheek to the face of the woman who has humiliated her, quietly and publicly, for over a decade. Alexandra does it. She offers her cheek. She has been doing things like this her whole life. And then Edward loses consciousness. The room is still. The doctors exchange glances, and Alexandra turns to the physician beside her, and in a voice that is very quiet and very clear, she says 4 words: "Get that woman away." Not a scream, not a breakdown, not the accumulated fury of 47 years of endurance finally exploding across a palace sick room. 4 words, quietly spoken, and then silence. That is the woman this film is about. The woman who bore everything with a composure that became legendary, and who, at the very end, drew one line that could not be crossed. To understand what Alexandra endured, you have to understand where she began. Because the woman who would become Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, the most admired royal consort in Europe, the woman whose style was copied by every fashionable woman on the continent, that woman started in an attic. She was born on the 1st of December 1844 in Copenhagen, the second child of Prince Christian of Schleswig-Holstein and his wife, Princess Louise of Hesse-Kassel. Her family was royal in name, a distant branch of the Danish House of Oldenburg, but royal in little else. Her father's income from his army commission was £800 a year. They lived in a grace and favour house provided by the Danish court. Alexandra shared a small attic bedroom with her younger sister, Dagmar. The 2 girls made their own clothes. It was, by the standards of European royalty, an almost laughably modest upbringing. But it was also, by all accounts, a genuinely happy one. Christian and Louise were devoted parents. The children ran freely through the Yellow Palace and the surrounding streets of Copenhagen. And occasionally, on special evenings, a particular visitor would come and sit with the children before they went to sleep. A tall, odd, gentle man named Hans Christian Andersen, who would settle into a chair and tell them stories. Alexandra grew up in a house where the greatest storyteller in the world came to visit. She grew up making her own clothes, sharing a bedroom, and learning that love was something you showed, not something you announced. These things shaped her. They made her, in the estimation of almost everyone who ever met her, genuinely warm. Not performatively gracious the way royalty often learns to be, but actually, naturally, straightforwardly kind. She was also extraordinarily beautiful from an early age. Dark eyes, fine features, a natural poise that seemed to require no effort at all. When she was 16, the British royal family began to take notice. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were searching for a bride for their eldest son, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, known to his family as Bertie. They needed someone Protestant, politically neutral, and suitable. Several candidates were considered and rejected. Eventually, they settled on Alexandra. She was, in the Queen's own words, the only one to be chosen. She was not quite 17 when she was formally proposed to. She had met Bertie twice. Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, was not an easy man to marry. He was not cruel, precisely. He was not cold. By many accounts, he was charming, warm, genuinely generous, and possessed of an easy, uncomplicated kindness toward people of all stations. Those who served alongside him noted that he treated everyone regardless of class or background with natural dignity. He was not a bad man, but he had appetites. For food, for comfort, for company, and most particularly for women. He had begun his romantic career before his engagement to Alexandra was even announced, a brief affair with an actress named Nellie Clifton, which had caused such distress to his father, Prince Albert, that the prince consort had travelled to confront him about it, fallen ill on the journey, and died within weeks. Queen Victoria, grief-stricken and searching for blame, would hold Bertie responsible for her husband's death for years. Alexandra knew none of this when she married him in March 1863. She was 18 years old. She wore a silver tissue dress trimmed with Honiton lace, with 8 bridesmaids to carry her train. The crowds that lined the streets of London that day were enormous. The people had taken this Danish girl to their hearts from the moment she arrived, drawn by her beauty and her evident warmth, and they would never let her go. She arrived in London with a modest wardrobe, mostly tailored by herself. Within weeks of her wedding, she was being described as the most elegant woman in England. Society copied everything she wore, everything she did, every choice she made. She had come from an attic in Copenhagen with £800 a year between 8 people, and she stepped into the centre of the most glittering social world in the world and simply belonged there. That was not performance. That was character. The affairs began almost immediately, not loudly. Nothing was ever done loudly in Victorian aristocratic society, but consistently, over decades, in the way that powerful men in that world conducted themselves when they believed their appetites were simply a fact of life rather than a choice. Bertie moved through a succession of women. Some were brief, some lasted years. The court knew, the aristocracy knew, eventually, inevitably, the newspapers knew. And Alexandra knew. She always knew. The first test came not from infidelity, but from illness. In 1867, pregnant with her 3rd child, Alexandra contracted rheumatic fever during labour. It was a serious crisis. There were hours when it was genuinely uncertain whether she would survive. She gave birth without chloroform, which the doctors feared would worsen her condition, enduring the pain attended only by her lady-in-waiting, Lady Macclesfield, who sat beside her throughout, holding her hand. Where was Bertie? Socialising, flirting with other women. He did not come to her bedside during the worst of it, and he was criticised for this from many quarters. Alexandra recovered eventually, but the fever left her with a permanent limp in her right leg and accelerated a hereditary deafness that would worsen steadily throughout her life. She would never again hear as clearly as she once had. The world would gradually grow quieter and more distant around her, in more ways than one. And then something happened that says everything about who Alexandra was. Society ladies, watching her move through ballrooms and drawing rooms with her slight, graceful limp, began to imitate it. Women who had no limp began to walk with one. It became known as the Alexandra limp, a fashion trend born from a woman's physical suffering, worn as a badge of style by those who admired her so completely they wanted to embody even her pain. Alexandra herself, characteristically, said nothing about it. The children kept coming, 6 in total, all apparently born prematurely. The 6th, a son born in April 1871, died the day after his birth. Alexandra asked for privacy in her grief. Queen Victoria, her formidable mother-in-law, insisted on announcing a formal period of court mourning anyway, which drew unwanted press attention to what Alexandra had simply wanted to endure quietly. She bore that too. In 1892, her eldest son, Albert Victor, the boy she had nursed through every childhood illness, the boy she had loved with a fierce and sometimes suffocating maternal devotion, died of pneumonia shortly after his 28th birthday. He had been engaged to be married. The wedding had been planned. Alexandra did not touch his room after his death. She kept it exactly as it was, every object in its place, a private shrine that no one was asked to explain or justify. She had loved him with everything she had. She never fully recovered from losing him. Through all of this, Bertie's affairs continued. Lily Langtry, Daisy Greville, Countess of Warwick, Agnes Kaiser, Jenny Jerome, who would later become the mother of Winston Churchill, and finally, from 1898 onwards, Alice Keppel. Young, charming, discreet, and absolutely embedded in the social world that Alexandra and Edward shared. Not a brief distraction, a permanent fixture. Alexandra's response to all of it, consistently and across decades, was the same. Composure, dignity, continued public warmth toward her husband, continued warmth even toward some of his mistresses. She was said to have preferred Lily Langtry to some of the others, apparently because she found her less intrusive. She was less comfortable with Alice Keppel, who accompanied Edward on holidays. The annual appearance at the Cowes Regatta particularly galled her, that most public of intrusions on what should have been her private time with her husband. But she never broke. Not publicly. Not once. It would be a mistake to read Alexandra's life as nothing but endurance. It was also, in a very real sense, a triumph. While Queen Victoria remained in deep mourning after the death of Prince Albert in 1861, withdrawing from public life for years, leaving the monarchy without a visible human face, it was Alexandra and Bertie who stepped in. They became the public presence of the British Crown. They opened things, attended things, and represented things. Victoria herself acknowledged that Alexandra worked tirelessly to spare her the strain and fatigue of official functions, and that she attended ceremonies with genuine enjoyment that made duty seem like pleasure. Alexandra was also, genuinely and practically, one of the most influential women in Europe. Not politically, she was largely excluded from wielding real political power, though she consistently tried to use whatever influence she had in favor of Denmark and Greece, the countries of her heart. But culturally, socially, aesthetically, her reach was extraordinary. She set a fashion that was copied across continents. She founded charitable institutions. She started Alexandra Rose Day, selling roses to raise money for hospitals, a tradition that continued for decades. She established the Imperial Military Nursing Service. She gave quietly and without fanfare to causes and people who had nothing. She was also, in ways that were not fashionable to acknowledge at the time, a person living with significant disability. Partially deaf for most of her adult life, growing almost entirely deaf in her later years, she navigated a world built for people who could hear easily, with a grace that never drew attention to the difficulty. She had a permanent limp. She had lost a child in infancy and an adult son in his prime. She had carried 6 pregnancies in the first 8 years of her marriage. She had done all of this while being one of the most visible women in the world, watched at every turn, photographed, commented upon, and required always to be composed. She was photographed endlessly, and she took to photography herself, becoming genuinely skilled with a camera at a time when it was considered a deeply eccentric hobby for a queen. She enjoyed woodworking. She kept dogs she adored and treated with a warmth that servants later recalled as entirely characteristic, the same warmth she extended to everyone who had no particular power or reason to impress her. She was, in short, a full human being. Not a saint, not a martyr. A woman of genuine warmth, considerable intelligence, deep faith, and remarkable resilience, living a life that asked more of her than it had any right to. By 1901, when Victoria finally died and Bertie became Edward VII, Alexandra was 56. She had been Princess of Wales for 38 years, longer than anyone before or since has held that title. She had been waiting, patiently and without complaint, in the role of supporting player for nearly 4 decades. And now, finally, she was Queen. She initially refused to move into Buckingham Palace. After Victoria's death, she had made Marlborough House in Sandringham her own, and she was not inclined to simply step into the spaces her mother-in-law had occupied. She came around eventually, and when she did, she redecorated. The private apartments and staterooms that had barely been touched in half a century were transformed by Alexandra's taste, and it is largely her vision that can be seen in those rooms today. The coronation was planned for June 1902. Days before it was due to take place, Edward fell seriously ill with appendicitis. Alexandra deputized for him publicly, attended Ascot in his place, and managed the appearance of normality with her customary efficiency. The coronation was postponed, an operation performed, and by August, the king was well enough to proceed. He and Alexandra were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. Alice Keppel remained a constant. Edward's affection for her had, by most accounts, become something less purely physical and something more like genuine companionship as both of them aged. She travelled with him. She was present in his social world in ways that Alexandra could not simply ignore. The annual appearance at Cowes, the holidays in Biarritz, the dinners from which Alexandra was absent. And Alexandra endured it. She did not leave. She did not cause a scene. She did not write an anguished memoir or confide in a sympathetic journalist. She kept her private feelings private in a way that would have been almost incomprehensible to a later age accustomed to the instant confession of royal suffering. She simply bore it, with the same composure she had brought to everything else. In the spring of 1910, Edward's health began to fail seriously. He had been ill in Biarritz with a chill that became bronchitis, which became something worse. Alexandra was abroad when the royal doctors finally telegraphed that she needed to come home. She returned to find a husband who was visibly dying, who would not admit it, who continued to insist he would not give in, continuing to dress and sit in his chair and receive visitors when his body was already failing him. On the 6th of May 1910, he suffered a series of heart attacks. His doctors urged him to rest. He refused. "I shall not give in," he told them. "I shall go on. I shall work to the end." His son, George, came to sit with him and told him that his horse had won at Kempton Park that afternoon. Edward replied faintly, "I have heard of it. I am very glad." Those were the last words he spoke. Before he lost consciousness, a message was sent. Alice Keppel was to come. Historically, there has been debate about exactly what happened in that room. There are versions of events that are kinder to Alice Keppel and to Alexandra. What is not in dispute is the essential shape of it. Alice Keppel came. She entered the sick room. She curtsied to the Queen, and Edward VII, barely conscious, managed to make his wishes known that these two women, his wife and his mistress, should make their peace in front of him. That Alexandra should kiss Alice. Alexandra, who had been doing impossible things with grace for 47 years, did it. She offered her cheek. What she felt in that moment no one recorded. What she showed was nothing. The same composure, the same face she had presented to the world since she was 18 years old and first understood what kind of life she had married into. And then Edward lost consciousness, and Alice Keppel lost control. She was, by the accounts of those present, hysterically overwhelmed in a way that the Queen, who had infinitely more to grieve, was not. Alexandra turned to the physician beside her, Sir Francis Laking, a man who had served the royal family for decades and understood the weight of everything that was not being said. "Get that woman away." 4 words, not shouted, not wept, simply said, with the quiet authority of a woman who had given more than enough, for longer than anyone had the right to ask, and who had decided that this room, in this moment, at the end of this particular story, was not a place where she was going to be required to give any more. Alice Keppel was taken out. The family gathered. Edward VII died at 11:30 that evening. Alexandra sat with his body through the night. She lived for another 15 years after his death. Queen Mother now, stepping back as her son, George V, and his wife, Mary, took the centre of the stage. She retreated to Sandringham, which she had always loved most, the house with the gardens and the dogs, and the particular quality of Norfolk light that she had made her own over decades. She lived through the First World War, which shredded the European royal family she had grown up within. Her nephew, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the husband of her sister Dagmar's daughter, was murdered with his wife and 5 children by Bolshevik forces in 1918. A whole branch of her family, simply gone. Her sister, Dagmar, survived, was rescued by a British warship, and came to live near Alexandra in England. They had shared that attic bedroom in Copenhagen 60 years before. Now they were the last 2 of a world that no longer existed. Alexandra's deafness worsened until she was almost entirely unable to hear. The world she moved through became progressively quieter, until communication required a particular kind of patience and closeness from those around her. She bore this as she had borne everything without complaint, without visible self-pity, with the same quality of presence that had defined her since she was a girl, listening to Hans Christian Andersen in Copenhagen. She died on the 20th of November, 1925 at Sandringham, of a heart attack, 11 days before her 81st birthday. She was the longest-lived queen consort since Eleanor of Aquitaine. She was buried beside Edward at Windsor Castle, the man who had given her so much to endure, and whom she had loved, in whatever complicated and battered form that love had taken by the end, until the very last. There is a particular kind of strength that history does not always know how to name. It is not the strength of rebellion or defiance or spectacular public gesture. It is quieter than that, and in many ways harder. It is the strength of a woman who decides every single morning to get up and continue. To be present. To be warm when coldness would have been easier. To maintain her own sense of who she was, regardless of what was done to her. To serve with genuine devotion a role that asked her to make herself secondary over and over again for nearly 5 decades. Alexandra did all of that. And then, at the very end, when the king she had served and loved and been failed by was losing consciousness for the last time, she said 4 words that contained everything she had never allowed herself to say out loud before. get that woman away. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, perhaps, exactly enough. Alexandra's story is one of those that tends to grow in weight the more you sit with it. Most people know her name, and perhaps the outline of her life: the beautiful Danish princess who became queen, the husband who strayed. But the full texture of what she actually lived through, and the particular kind of courage it took to live through it the way she did, doesn't often get the attention it deserves. We hope this film has changed that. If it has, please share it with someone who might not yet know her story. And if you haven't already subscribed to History Roadshow, we would love to have you with us. There are more stories like this one, coming from women whose lives deserve more than a footnote, told the way they actually were. Thank you for watching.